This show is sponsored by idealworkspace.com, which promotes a healthier way of working through their adjustable standing desk. Check out their latest smart adjustable standing desk at altizen.com, altizen.com. Welcome to Analyse Asia, the podcast dedicated to dissect the pulse of business, technology, and media in Asia. In this episode, I speak to Chirayu Wadke, partner from Seedplus, and in the first part of our conversation, we discuss the venture capital landscape and the major trends in smartphone, Internet of Things, and autonomous vehicles across Asia Pacific. Hi Chirayu.
Hey, how are you?
I'm good. How are you doing?
Very well. Thanks for having me on the show.
You're in the Seedplus office in Singapore?
That's right.
Yeah. And send my regards to Smithy and Tiang. But today, I have Chirayu Wadke, partner from Seedplus. I know he's very focused on a very interesting category of Internet of Things and mobility. Since you are here, and we have been talking a lot about all the different interesting topics, whether it's mobility, IoT landscape, and even the recent Broadcom and Qualcomm deal that fell apart. So before we get into all those subjects of the day, I want to try to get to know you better. How do you start your career?
Sure. Yeah, so I actually started my career hoping I would join a phone company called Nokia, but it did not happen. I landed up joining Accenture because actually, interestingly, Nokia decided they did not want to hire me. This was in 2006, an interesting time when Nokia was probably at the peak. So I got into consulting and got into technology consulting. And, this was the communications, high-tech consulting at Accenture. And I did that for a bit. And, before I knew it, consulting had become boring. And, I had joined a massive telco from the US that wanted to set up some interesting scouting office in Asia. So that's how my first few years was spent, if I may, in terms of, how I got my career started.
And then subsequently, where do you go to and how do you get to a current role then?
Yeah, so I think after that, what happened is, when I was scouting for Verizon Wireless, the carrier that I joined, I realized that there's a lot happening, but it was too early. And, this is sort of on the borderline of iPhone just being launched and still sort of predominantly dominated by the pre-iPhone ecosystem or just the chaos that was. The ideas that were floating around in markets like Asia was still sort of not there in terms of what they had to bring to Verizon Wireless, for example. So I decided to pack my bags and go to the US. This was, on behest of an interesting project that was tossed in my direction, was to put together a JV between AT&T, T-Mobile, and Verizon Wireless. So I worked on that for a bit, launched what is possibly the first broad-based mobile NFC wallet in the US, and then a bunch of other sort of ancillary payments initiatives at Verizon Wireless. But yeah, that led me to Google that was doing its own wallet initiatives in a slightly different way. And I was attracted by what was happening on the West Coast and decided to join Google and its payments initiatives. So had the opportunity to work on the ecosystem, building out the ecosystem for the mobile wallet, both the first two versions of the product. And then when it became sort of an API in Android, the transition to that API was also something I had an opportunity to work on. Post working on that stuff, I actually looked at a different area within Google, which was doing wireless, and had another opportunity to launch what I call sort of a game-changing product or category, if I may, which was changing the existing routing infrastructure in people's homes. And, that was a phenomenal experience in sort of taking a concept that was literally a system on chip and then building a whole ecosystem of the product and distribution channel as well as branding around it. So that's apparently doing well now. That's what I hear. So yeah, so worked on primarily on those two projects. And then towards the end, I worked on something interesting. I was working on YouTube and did some work around caching YouTube in emerging markets. And we were sort of doing caching using satellite communication to the edge of networks. And we started out with Wi-Fi. And then I also had the opportunity to work on the Google Wi-Fi stuff that was happening in India. So all the railway stations were getting wired up for 6 Mbps up or down, and the kind of speeds that pre sort of Reliance Jio were unheard of. Yeah, so that kind of triggered a thought that, hey, there's a significant change happening in Asia. The amount of mobile handsets that we were talking about had completely changed. The quality of those handsets had gone up, and businesses that we initially thought were hard to sort of make work are possibly there for the taking and accelerating. And that triggered a thought of coming back and figuring out if there was a place I could literally get on the ground floor and, make some of these ideas come to reality. So, I knew the Jungle Ventures guys for a while, and they said, they had a thought of putting together a seed fund. And that's how I kind of decided to join Smithy, Tiang, and Gabriel and made my way back in some sense to Singapore.
So you have a pretty interesting career. You went from consulting, you went to Google, and then now you're a venture capitalist.
Yeah, there's only one other person that's actually pointed that out to me, believe it or not. And they said, you've done consulting, you've done operating, and now you're doing investing. So you finished the sort of trifecta there.
Yeah, so I might just try to ask you this then. What are the interesting career lessons that you can share with my audience?
So I think, I would say that firstly, the thing that has worked for me is I always believed in non-incremental changes. So, if I'm working somewhere, I'm working on a project or working in a company, if my next thing has to be substantive and different, and it has to add an element to myself as a person that I did not have before. So an example would be jumping from consulting to doing sort of scouting for a carrier. I hadn't done scouting, but that didn't sort of bother me necessarily. And then I went to the US with the carrier. Then Google came knocking on my door, and in between I had even toyed with a startup that got very well funded. Actually, I still hold founding shares in that startup. So it was a brief 6 to 8 month period when I actually toyed with the startup. Then I got into Google. So again, there was no plan, but the idea was that every change has to be 10x in some sense over the previous in terms of learning, and eventually, hopefully, accomplishments will follow. So that's the model that I've consistently used for making decisions on what happens next.
I'm always very curious when I have venture capitalists on my show. I always ask them this question. Can you talk about what is your normal day like as a venture capitalist?
The thing that I would call out is it's a very event-driven job. So, because deal flow that comes in is not consistent. It's very up and down. So people typically like to put a process around it. But the reality is that, this is a very event-driven thing. You might find a company that's exciting and suddenly you have 3 that are exciting and you suddenly are sort of completely booked. But in a typical day, it would be a combination of spending time on new deals that have come through, spending time on due diligence that we already have in the pipeline. And then lastly, but very importantly, spending, and this changes as the fund becomes more mature, is spending as much time as possible with our portfolio companies. And, as we walk through the life cycle of a fund, the time we spend with portfolio companies goes up. That's typically sort of a day life of a VC.
So what's your current role and coverage within Seedplus? I think the question for me to ask is, do you have like an investment thesis, or there is a category that you're focused on?
Yeah, so the investment thesis broadly is I'm doing connected devices, IoT, mobility from a transport standpoint, and then, other hardware technology that may or may not be related to, any of this other stuff. But that's really broadly my mandate that I cover. And the region that I've typically sort of looked at has been broader Asia Pacific. So, everything that goes from India all the way to Australia, New Zealand, Taiwan, Southeast Asia, of course, but also stuff that occasionally sort of comes out of Shenzhen that's looking for dollar investments versus RMB. They tend to sort of find their way out. This has been sort of the combination of my existence in some sense over the last 1.5 years.
So any interesting companies that you have invested within your portfolio? I know that all venture capitalists like to talk about, they don't want to name their favorite child. I just want to know, like, what are the kind of companies that you have invested so far, and can you just name them?
Yeah, so I have 2 in the portfolio right now, but I expect to have another one soon. So can't talk about that, but I'll talk about the ones that are already there. So the first one is a company called Cove IoT. It's sort of building a software platform for wearables. And its sort of first target market is luxury watches. So they figured out quickly that Android Wear had its own challenges in terms of scaling in the branded ecosystem because of, they literally sort of equalize everybody's differentiation, and that was not acceptable to a lot of the brands. These guys come from Nokia. They're based out of Singapore, but offices in Shenzhen, Bangalore, and Geneva. We have invested in this company with a Swiss design house, which is a strategic. What this company does is basically just build the software platform and the some of the hardware stuff inside Swiss watches. So when Swiss watches that look analog from the outside but connect to your phone, that's the technology that they're building. They call it sort of, smart analog in some sense. The brand is still sort of stays with its look and feel, but it can connect to a smartphone and has a ton of sensors inside it. That's what the company is up to.
Then the other one?
The other one is interesting. So, we invested in a previously sort of successful founder who sold his previous company to Walmart. The idea was that he was a CTO of a massive hardware company, traditional hardware company that sells point of sale terminals. And I think that kind of led him to believe that the ecosystem in the IoT world is getting increasingly complex. The fragmentation is getting to be very complex for facility managers and IT managers to keep control of. And, he had some scars to show from managing, almost 1 million POS systems that are floating out there, and they go down and, you can't patch them remotely. He thought of a software which kind of may help to get around that problem. So he's building a company called Copper. And the first product is sort of an incident management software platform that allows, starting with retailers to facilities managers, to have a single pane of glass to not control, but to look at incidents across their infrastructure. So in case of a retailer, that could be HVAC, POS systems, backend sort of IT stuff inside a store, and be able to figure out, hey, the HVAC system in aisle number 4 is not working, and there's a likelihood that there's dairy stock there and it all might go to waste. So why don't we kind of figure out it's a critical problem? And all this is sort of visually available across different retail locations. So that's sort of the premise of reducing the heartburn that happens when managing complex infrastructure, specifically on the physical side. And that's where the IoT piece comes. So he's based out of the Valley, but we have some projects now running in Singapore as well for him. That's the second company.
So I get you today to talk about two major topics, because we have private conversations on that recently in a couple of meetups. So one of them is pertaining to the mobility and the Internet of Things landscape, because I think a lot has changed over the last few years. I think we talk about the glorious days of Nokia is over, and then now it's the duopoly of iOS and Android. Where do you see the mobility landscape evolving, and what are the major trends that is coming?
So I think, there have been 3 ecosystems, and we are on the verge of the third one, right? I mean, broadly, there's the PC ecosystem that was Intel dominated. Then the mobile, as you said, the mobile ecosystem. And we are on the verge of, I would say, that the next transition to voice assistance, and that ecosystem is completely different. So I would sort of just frame the conversation in that sense, that that's the environment that we are operating. Having said that, unlike the previous ecosystems, we haven't seen evidence yet, and maybe things will change, of mobile phones not being at the center of someone's universe. Not yet, at least. Maybe it'll happen in the future, but we haven't seen people sort of saying they start spending more time on talking to voice assistants to get stuff done versus continue to use their mobile device. So, mobile devices are going to continue to stay, right? And the question is that likely to be the control point that it has always been for the last 10 years. And where I see this going is, I think the fragmentation on Android is a concern for sure. I think Apple's kind of not been largely unchanged over the past several years in terms of what it believes in. But I think what's happened on the Android side is that as this market has grown, it has introduced more variations than what's actually might be in favor of the consumer. And experiences are increasingly sort of broken and siloed. And Android itself, can be forked in 8 different ways, and you have different versions of it. So I think this fragmentation leads to the question on, where does this go? And, some attempts were made by Andy Rubin, Playground, etc., to, answer some of those questions. And there have been others like Xiaomi that have been trying to answer that question. But the reality is that the way this works is the value is in the services layer. And if you're able to sort of tie up the services layer in a neat way, you do have a lot of influence and control over the rest of the ecosystem. Because I don't think it's hard today to take off-the-shelf operating system and make it reliable. I think that it's a science now. It doesn't need more innovation. I think the question becomes, are the services valuable enough to actually walk away from, say, a Google? I hadn't seen anything for a long time in terms of disrupting that, other than China that openly just blocks Google. So state sort of getting in the way of, in some sense, of success. But other than that, if I were to sort of think about a ground-up methodology of tackling this, I saw some interesting stuff going on in India, and that kind of triggered the thought, right? So Jio launched last year, and then it's on a tear ever since, and it's got 100+ million users, and it's got it acquired or semi-acquired Savan, which is a music app, and it's looking at other applications. And one of the thought that came to me was, if it has the eyeballs it does, and it gets the applications that are popular, like a Hotstar or maybe some of the others, it's possible that you might create a bundle that includes, say, a Facebook through WhatsApp, but doesn't include Google. And then at that point, the question becomes, if you have an alternative paying mechanism that doesn't include a Google Play, it's possibly a Paytm or whatever that may be. Theoretically, is it possible to actually create another ecosystem, right? And it's kind of the carrier taking revenge against the tech companies, right? But that's some of the thinking that I had, that, if Reliance creates that playbook, it's possible that because of its 100 million plus consumer base, that it actually controls the consumer base and it can do this, and it's thinking about application the right way, like almost like a non-carrier. But the challenge is, to be honest, cultural, right? I mean, the reality is that Google and Android became so successful was not because of smart strategies alone, but the APIs, the engineering that goes into, if you look at the Android software, the way it's coded, it's so well written in Java. Some of those techniques in terms of not having technical debt on the engineering side and being able to build APIs and integrations that are seamless is a non-trivial thing to achieve at scale, right? So while, carriers have demonstrated, or rather one carrier has demonstrated some success, I often believe that cultural renaissance is the one that comes in the way of ultimate success. And I don't know if Reliance or any other carrier in the world has that. So I think the jury is out there. I'm not quite sure. It may be a one-off that Reliance is successful for a brief period, but I believe to create an operating system and a platform needs completely different thinking. And I'm really not sure if a carrier has that thought process.
I'm interested to follow up on the conversation. You mentioned Reliance Jio in India, which came up with a very interesting business model by offering first for free and then subsequently start charging users on services. And you also see the same with Xiaomi in China, but I think they have evolved given their pending IPO that's coming in the next 1 to 2 months. They have started in the services, but they also dive deep a little bit in the hardware. I think what is interesting to me now is, do you believe that cultural factors is the only thing that will drive growth of the emerging markets for mobile itself?
No, I mean, I think the ability to create a platform is what, is a function of the culture. But I think what Reliance has adequately demonstrated is, if you provide the connectivity and provide it at a cost that's acceptable, you can have 70-80% conversion rates to paid. And that's what they've demonstrated, apparently. So, they gave the whole thing free, but they charge for the hardware, and, they kind of amortize that cost across the life of the subscriber. But they were able to get a whole bunch of subscribers to start using services. So my sense is, and I think same with Xiaomi, right? My sense is that the ability to convert from free to paid is not like what is globally an average, right? Where it's 1%, and for Dropbox, it's like 3 or 4% maybe. I think the difference here is, I don't think the customers who are using this have ever used data before, and we take for granted. And I think what happens is, when they do that, they get hooked on and they're ready to pay because they see value beyond just messaging. I think that's what is happening. And China is probably more advanced, where Xiaomi has gone beyond just phones, right? It's an entire IoT ecosystem that they've built around Xiaomi. So it's an interesting play.
I think that there's another interesting thing that came out from the Reliance Jio model, is that they discovered that the average usage giving an Indian customer free is about 29 gigabytes of data. And what happens is that now it's percolating across Asia Pacific, with telcos giving data plans that is about 28 to 29 gigabytes as if it is unlimited. So it just taught everybody what is the right model to price and push everybody towards a particular business model.
Yeah, I mean, they tested the waters on an asymptotic maximum, right? That, how much can a person use if they watch all the movies possible in a month, right? That's what I think they kind of prove. But that's possible because they had some unique advantages, both from a regulatory standpoint as well as from I think deep pockets do matter, right? So they had the ability to burn for some time before converting everybody to paid.
So given that we see wearables and IoT hovering around the smartphone ecosystem, do you see them as an augmentation to the smartphone, or can they be a foreshadow to something that might come up? For example, we haven't talked about anything in virtual and augmented reality. And we also have devices that are wearable, such as a Google Glass, Apple EarPod. I mean, you talk about sound assistant speakers, so all these things are actually all hovering around, but it seems that the smartphone is still the center of the universe.
Yeah, so I think, there are two mental models here. One mental model is the wearables, right? Which is, I augment myself with stuff, with hardware on my body, and that's how kind of life is. The other stuff is, wearables, which I call which is, you walk into a room and you have the infrastructure wired up that gives you sort of a voice assistant or maybe something else in the future. I really feel that the latter mental model is likely to be more successful, but I could be wrong. There are specific use cases of wearables or other sort of hardware that may be useful. But if I think about, say, an AR headset or just wearing sort of a HoloLens or something like that, I think the technology is still far away from being a serious sort of mainstream item. Inherently, if you think about it, I rather not have something that I need to wear all the time or on me than if the option exists, right? So I think where I stand is I'm squarely sort of saying that I think the world will move to an environment where the infrastructure you walk in will respond to your presence and therefore offer you services versus sort of you wearing something to necessary to augment your environment.
Then this comes to the hardware part, right? You now see Google and Apple building their own semiconductor chips focusing on the AI processing. And what's happening, it seems to be that we have this basically client and server side type of strategy. It used to be everything is deployed from the cloud. Now everything is going back to the services is deployed within the device itself. This paradigm will keep changing depending on when and where the flavor of the month goes. Do you see this would have an impact in terms of the semiconductor industry moving in a different direction, or do you just see that this is just a temporal? Because we discussed this to quite a lot of the details with regards to the Broadcom Qualcomm deal during our meetup. So before that, I thought I should just ask this question to see what are your thoughts on that.
So, I think the silicon industry is interesting that, if any new category is created, they make a lot of profits before being completely commoditized, right? So if you look at the PC industry or the smartphone industry, the smartphone industry specifically, we are enjoying the dividends of what the smartphone wars, if I may. I think what that did was put a lot of pressure because of the volumes on silicon companies to lower prices to the point where they became extremely uncompetitive on their own as small companies and decided to merge into larger ones. Effectively what used to be a build versus buy decision for a lot of the larger firms became a build decision. And because the silicon companies were not innovating ahead of the curve, it was rather, top-down innovation that was starting on the software layer side and driving the demand for more powerful chips. And therefore, the silicon industry was almost sort of reacting to the requirements that Google or Apple would give them. Inherently, what that does is when Google thinks or Apple thinks about building something new, and when it goes out into the market, the likelihood that someone's actually building something with those specs is very low. Unlike, what used to happen before, where the silicon industry had a little more power in the value chain, the smartphone wars and price erosion had led their investment appetite to be extremely low. So they wouldn't invest in something that had no sales or hope of sales in the near future. And therefore, you're seeing what you are because a lot of what Apple and Google have started believing is that it might be useful to actually vertically integrate and optimize performance right down to the silicon versus having to deal with silicon providers coming in saying they need to sort of coming in to pitch a custom chip that's typically very expensive and they don't have control over it and they don't get the quality of service that they need because, the moment it's a custom chip, the company will charge them a lot of money and, then look to sort of take that custom chip over time and make it more mainstream. So the vendor ecosystem was damaged in some sense by the Googles, Apples, and, I wouldn't say damaged, but, it was just the nature of the beast of this being a very large market that led to price pressure on silicon companies that led their investment appetite to zero. So therefore, you see what you do. And I don't think it's going back and forth. I think it's just reacting to the market. I mean, I can tell you in another situation, for example, if you look at the self-driving car industry, for example, NVIDIA is charging a bomb for its chipsets, its SoCs and its GPUs. So it's not unheard of when an industry is new and the silicon company actually is the bottleneck and charges a ton of money. But over time, competition catches up, prices go down and so on and so forth with volume. I would say that there are categories where Google and Apple are likely to build their own, but there might be stuff where they are likely to look at the future, at the environment, for example, right? I mean, even if I look at stuff like sensors, right? Radars, for example. When Google started its self-driving car program, or even the other, GM started its program, I don't believe the radars were even there, the quality of the radars or the kind of resolution that these companies needed. And therefore, a lot of these companies landed up building their own. That seems to be sort of a pattern in this, right? Which is when you're ahead of the game and you're innovating, you tend to sort of have to build your own in some sense.
My last question before we take the break. You have been looking a lot in the Internet of Things space, or what we call the IoT space now. And you also talk about looking into the transportation space. I would presume that mainly will be in self-driving cars or even drones as such. Where do you see for the trend lines in that part of it? I call that connected transportation because it used to be bits shifting bits. Now it's bits shifting atoms. So where do you see that space moving as well?
So you try to understand this question. This is around drones, or is it around mobility in general and connected?
My view is actually mobility in general. A lot of people like to separate it out, but to me, they're doing the same thing. When people talk about drones, the aviation problem is already solved, right? What is not solved is the network, the cybersecurity problem. To me, the self-driving car problem is not about driving. The driving problem is already solved. What the people are solving now is whether to get it to move autonomously from point A to point B using networks and cybersecurity as well. To me, they fall within that same category. So when I think about IoT, it's about trying to put the sensors around them, trying to make them work better to be more efficient in personal mobility, or even it could be a group mobility when you talk about bus as well.
If you ask me about the trends, I think we have a thesis around mobility, and that's divided into, some pieces. I mean, one is obviously infrastructure for self-driving cars, and we've seen some stuff around sensors, around LiDAR sensors, around radar. The other piece is, as you mentioned, is security and privacy. And what happens when these vehicles become, in some sense, start capturing a lot of data? How do you kind of ensure, A, they're not hacked, and B, the data is secure? And lastly, I think we've also looked at logistics, and there's a lot of play happening in connected logistics. And our worldview is there's a lot going on, but I don't think anybody's sort of squarely solving the problem beyond just creating SaaS infrastructure, so software as a service, using some pieces of hardware that are connected to the vehicle. I don't think people have gone beyond that in some sense. We fall squarely in those three buckets, and the one that's most interesting to us is honestly on the security side of the house for vehicles, because we think it's an untapped area. It's underinvested as well. There's not too much of investment that's actually gone into figuring out how security companies would actually address that challenge. And I'm really not sure it's a product idea there. I mean, I've always said that it's a product idea, but there could be a services play there where a services company actually audits and validates the security of the software created by multiple OEMs, right? So I don't know. I mean, I don't know what the hypotheses there could be, but getting into the OEMs or the self-driving world with a product that's saying, I'm going to sort of sit inside your software and give you sort of additional features or give the consumer more features, that's going to be an interesting paradigm if it does happen. Would love to know, if there are other approaches that you've seen, perhaps, I don't know. But we think of our worldview that way. And for us, security is the most interesting amongst the three problems.
And is that if you want to get into this space because these are mainly embedded technologies, the services model would be where you should start off, and then you try to decouple more and more so that you can get into the system itself. So for example, if you think about drones, you'll probably think about inspections as a service, but you move closer and closer to the hardware and the software integration side. That's how I'm thinking about the space in general.
With the way I think about it, and increasingly, the data suggests that product security companies are becoming harder, and services companies are actually making more money, or security services is actually a much larger industry than, or rather revenue than product. So in this case, actually, the two trends come together, and I'm saying, maybe there's an answer here where you are like almost like a mechanic, right? Or a mechanics shop, or a, auto repair shop that existed in 50 years ago, where vehicles would sort of be repaired. And here's an equivalent of that where you're a services company that makes sure the quality is good before the software is shipped on the device. Right? I don't know. I'm kind of open about new ideas in this space.
We will take a break now, and then we'll come back and we'll talk about why the Broadcom and Qualcomm deal fell apart.
Okay.